welcome back to Jen's Books. I hope you've had a great week. This video is my roundup for August. I'll post the link to my first roundup where I talked about the first 6 books I read in the description down below. But I've read, again, a real weird mix of books that I've really enjoyed. So I've got a Booker long listed book, the first one off the long list that I've read. I've got sci-fi, I've got Gothic fiction, all sorts of weird things I've read, but some really good reads. I like weird books, that's not a complaint, but some really interesting reads to share with you again. So the first one I wanted to talk to you about was Pine by Francine Toon. So I fancied a bit of Gothic. I'm a mood reader, so for all my best plans, if I'm going to read this and this, I prefer to just pick up what I fancy at the time. And this is a book that's been by my bed for a long time, and I keep meaning to read up, and it keeps getting superseded by other novels. So this is Pine. As I say, it was published in 2020. It's a Gothic novel based in a sort of rural Scotland. It was shortlisted for the Bloody Scotland Crime Debut of the Year. And I'd got confused between this and a book called House in the Pines, and I kept thinking that I'd read it and I hadn't, so that's why I finally decided to read it. So it's a story of a young teenage girl called Lauren who lives with her father. Her father has issues with alcohol, and he sort of does odd jobs and things, but he's also a musician, and they live together, very isolated, not only literally, but also there's sort of suspicion that surrounds the family. Many years ago, when Lauren was very small, her mother went missing and she was never found, and never know what happened to her, and all eyes kind of went to her father Niall, and this idea that maybe he had something to do with her disappearing. What I really loved about this novel is the atmosphere. It's got really, you know, if you want a Gothic novel, you can't go wrong with sort of cold, isolated, you know, Scotland, you know, woodlands, and it's good, in this sort of paranormal elements as well. So we begin the book with, as you do all good Gothic books, on Halloween, and Lauren's going trick-or-treating with her friend Billy and his mother, and on the way back her father picks her up, and they see a woman dressed in a white bathrobe at the end of the side of the road, and her father picks this woman up, takes her home, and cleans her up. But the next day this woman's gone, and the father seems to have no memory of this ever occurring, but Lauren does. So there's these sort of very strange, uncanny elements throughout. I found it a little bit slow to start. You know, there's quite a lot of characters to get your head around, but really enjoyable. And this sort of mystery of what happened to Lauren's mother is at the heart of the novel. And on top of that, another local young woman goes missing as the novel sort of progresses, and again all eyes look towards Niall, and whether there is some you know, link towards the events of the missing mother, this woman in white who keeps appearing, and the disappearance of this young woman in the current day. So it's told in third person point of view, so there's a certain amount of distance, and it jumps between Lauren and her father. And even though we're seeing through Niall's eyes, there's still that sense of potentially him being an unreliable narrator, which I found quite enjoyable to read. So that was the first read that I read, and if you like Gothic novels, you may enjoy this one. It's not possibly not my favourite one I've ever read, but I did really enjoy it, and I thought there was a really good mystery at the core of it. The next book is one that I've already mentioned in my books, 6 from the shelf, books that play with time, and it's This Is How You Lose the Time War by Max Gladstone. And this is one I definitely recommend, although, as I say, I was determined not to enjoy this book because it's not a genre that I particularly like to read. It's very sort of feels very sci-fi, and I started reading it and I felt sort of a disconnect to the events, and I thought, I'm not going to enjoy this. And for the first 20-30 pages I thought, I'm going to put this down, but I persevered with it, and by the end of it I really loved it. It just really surprised me that it drew me in when I didn't think that I was going to enjoy it at all. And basically, it's published in 2019. It's a novella, and at the core of it, there are these two factions, two agencies, the garden and the agency, and we have two agents that work for them. One's just simply called Blue and one's simply called Red, and it's their job to make changes in the timeline, think multiverse theory, to ensure that certain events take place further along or that they don't take place. So these two factions are at war, so they go in and they make changes to try and scupper events, to ensure that their faction come out on top. But these are both sort of elite soldiers, and it feels like they're kind of biomechanical as well. And one day one of them leaves a message for the other one, kind of a sort of a ha kind of a smug message that they've beaten them on this occasion. But although they know it's against the rules, they start this sort of correspondence between the two of them, and over the length of the novella they form a really close attachment. And what I also really loved about it is there's lots of kind of little nods and intertextuality there to pick up on as well. So one of the characters, I think it's Blue, but forgive me if I'm wrong, likes to go and see shows of Shakespeare and whatever sort of multiverse version they end up in, because in some it's a tragedy, in some it's a comedy, and in some versions, you know, it plays out as we know and both characters die, and in other versions they survive, and that's kind of played out in the novel as well. And as I say, there was a lot about this that I found quite disorientating to begin with, because they're jumping between different time periods, some which are familiar to us, some which aren't. They never fully develop because they're only snippets. But I really, really enjoyed it. As I say, surprised me completely. I'd love to know if anybody's read this and what your thoughts were on it, and whether you enjoyed it as well, or whether you sort of found it difficult to read, or whatever your thoughts are. I'd love to know. But it's the first sort of one of the first co-written books. It's by Max Gladstone and Amal El-Mohtar, so it was written by two people as well, and I'm intrigued as to know how that worked, and whether one wrote one character and one wrote the other. It'd be interesting to know a little bit more about that. But yeah, definitely recommend that one. The next book I wanted to talk about was the first on the book along list that I've read, and that's Study for Obedience by Sarah Bernstein. I was drawn to this initially by the cover. I thought it was probably going to be a historical novel. I was completely wrong. And it's an interesting one. Again, it's a book that, to begin with, I thought I'm not going to enjoy this and I'm not going to want to read it. I'm glad I persevered with it. It's probably not one that I'm going to reread, but there's a lot to unpick about it that's really interesting. So from that point of view, it definitely feels like a book along list. Not sure whether it will make it to the shortlist, but then I've not read any others yet, so I'll let you know on that one. So this was written in 2023. And it's about an unnamed narrator who goes to help look after her brother in the countryside. We're never completely clear where it is they're living. There's a disconnect between the language. She doesn't speak the language of the local people, but it's definitely somewhere rural. Initially, again, as I say, I thought this was going to be a historical novel, but then they start talking about things like Wi-Fi, and it's very clear that it isn't a historical novel. But again, there's a sense of an unrelatable, well, kind of unrelatable, unreliable narrator here. And Bernstein does some really interesting things with the language. So you get a lot of really long sentences and a lot of really long paragraphs, and there's a lot of internalization through the character. And reading it, I found it quite suffocating to begin with. I found it quite difficult not to have these breaks, not to have any escapes from this narrator's point of view. It's told in first person point of view. I got a little bit of vibes of Eleanor Oliphant, only in that this is a character that there's a disconnect between them and the world around them. But it's also sort of a tale in, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean you're wrong. So the sort of story, the study for obedience, is the fact that this narrator, she's from a large family, and even when she was a child, she kind of did everything. She was taught to be completely obedient, to not think about what her wants and desires are, and to exist only to look after other people. There are some potential hints that maybe she was abused further than that, but it's the impact that this has on her as an adult, and the way she reacts to people, and the way she feels her way through society. And once she moves to this location, strange things start to happen. So there's a sheep she finds that's lost a ewe. There's a pig that loses a litter, crushes a litter of piglets. There's a phantom pregnancy with a dog. Just these really weird and bizarre things, and there's more of them than that. That kind of feel awry, and the narrator begins to be concerned that the villagers and the people around her are perhaps blaming her for these untoward events, and it kind of unravels from there. And it's sort of an ambiguous ending. I enjoyed the book as it went on, but I did find that slightly unusual way of storytelling, those really long sentences, the long paragraphs, that kind of claustrophobic closeness to this character. And at some points it feels like a stream of consciousness. I found that quite difficult to get my head round to begin with, and not the most pleasurable reading experience. But I feel like that was, you know, those were intentional stylistic choices. So again, it's one that'd be interesting to know what other people's thoughts are. Completely different than I thought it was going to be. Say probably not one that I'd read again, but interesting from the point of view of the style and the questions that it asks of the reader. So there was that one. The next three books I read were all ones that I read on my e-reader, so I will be including photos of those on here. I like my e-reader. I do try and sort of, there's no replacement for a proper book. There's no replacement, in my opinion, for a proper book, but it's so handy, and you can get copies of text for a lot cheaper. So it's quite nice to use both, and particularly when you're travelling, I travel quite a lot, it can be incredibly handy. So the first book I read was actually some sci-fi. I've talked before on this channel about The Death of Grass by John Christopher, which is a book that I really love. It's an apocalyptic book based in England, and it's for adults. And I really enjoy that. So when I realised that The Tripods was also written by John Christopher, I thought that I would really like to read those. I'm of a certain generation. When I was very little, there was a series made of these books on Saturday night TV, and I can't remember hardly anything about it. I was very young, but it disturbed me in the best way possible. And so I've always quite fancied reading the books. And it's a series of books. They're YA books, or even younger, really. The main character is 13. Really easy to read. And I actually found this first book very gripping, and I intend to continue with the series and read them. But it is sort of a more simplistic storytelling style, because, you know, it's aimed at a younger audience. So this was published in 1967, so much older text than the other text I'm talking about today. And it's about a character called Will, who lives in this almost utopian society ruled by the tripods. So it's the humanity has kind of regressed to almost sort of medieval times, and he lives in a rural farming agricultural area. And when children hit the age of 14, they undergo a process called capping. So these giant metal tripods that no one really knows what they are come along, and they whisk the young people up, and they have sort of a metal plate fused to the scalp. And when they are returned to the ground, they have a big celebration, but they're very compliant and non-troublemaking, not curious. They're all happy, but there's not freedom of thought. And then one day Will runs into a vagrant. Vagrants tend to be people who have had this capping process, but it's not worked. So for some reason or another, they become mentally ill. They end up travelling. They never belong anywhere. People look after them and give them food, but they never really recover from the process. So he meets this vagrant, but there's something about them that intrigues Will, and then they discover that actually this individual isn't actually a vagrant. They've got a false cap, and he tells them that everybody's living under the control of the tripods, and basically there's this place in Switzerland called the White Mountains where he can go and be free and not be controlled by these machines that no one really knows what they are. So Will goes off on a journey, you know, the hero quest to get to the White Mountains, and he ends up taking his cousin Henry, who he doesn't like, with him. And on the way they meet up with another young person around the same age called Jean-Paul, or they're called Beanpole, and the three of them go on the journey to the White Mountains, sort of pursued by the tripods. And as I say, I found it really quite gripping, particularly in the later stages. The end is a bit abrupt, but I'm really looking forward to finding out what happens as they go on the journey. It's sort of a bit more of the world is revealed, and it works quite well because us, you know, as people outside of the circumstances, understand a bit more about the history of the locations when they come across destroyed cities and things like that. And so we know this is sort of isn't a historical novel. It's something that's taken place after, you know, our day and time. So looking forward to reading the next one of that. Quite a quick read, but as I say, quite pacey throughout. The next book I wanted to talk about was The Secrets of Heartwood Hall. That was published this year, 2023, and it was written by Katie Lumsden. This is another Gothic novel, very much influenced by Victorian Gothic novels. It's based in 1852. We have a governess, a widow, who goes to work in this sort of crumbling Victorian mansion in the middle of nowhere. There are rumours around the house of hauntings, and the locals won't go near. There are lots of familiar tropes here. So if you enjoy those sorts of Gothicana kind of novels that are loosely historical, you'd probably enjoy this. But I did find it relied a lot on those tropes, those well-worn tropes, and it felt influenced by a lot of novels, including Lady Chatterley's Lover, among others. But I found it very slow to begin with. It didn't really... I enjoyed it. It was easy to read. It's not like I didn't want to read it, but it didn't drag me on. It didn't feel like there was a whole lot at stake to begin with. But the character, Margaret... She is a widow, as I say. She comes to live at Hartwood Hall. She has her own secrets and mysteries. At the hall, there are a small set of servants, and all of those have their own little secrets and mysteries as well. And certainly Louis, the child that he's looking after, and Mrs. Eversham, his mother, have their own sort of set of secrets. And throughout the book, those are slowly revealed, and the tension rickets up. So I did enjoy the book. I did enjoy it. The latter half more than the first half, I found it quite slow. It's not my favourite Gothic novel that I've read, but if you like, you know, it does what it says on the box, really. If you enjoy those kind of novels, you're probably going to enjoy The Secrets of Heartwood Hall. So if it's something that appeals to you, give it a go. And last of all, I read a thriller, because sometimes you just need a thriller. So I'm a mood reader, and sometimes I just crave a page turner, and Lucy Clarke is a writer who does them very well. So I read No Escape, which is actually a book that she brought out a few years ago in 2018, and it takes place on a yacht called the Blue, or around a yacht, but it goes between past and present throughout, and the story is told in third person through the eyes of Lana. Her and her friend Kitty have been friends. They've bonded since they were children. They both lost their mothers, and because of that, they've always felt really close, and they're just like the absolute best of friends. And when relationship breaks down between Lana and her dad, the two of them run off to the Philippines, and they end up getting on board this yacht called the Blue, sailing around the islands, and making their way to New Zealand. And we know at the beginning that something's happened, because Lana's no longer on the boat, and she's suddenly heard that the boat has sunk, and she's waiting to hear if anybody survives. So it's going between the current, when she's sort of waiting to hear news, and the past, which explains the events that took place up to the point she left the boat. So there's her and Kitty. There's Aaron, who's kind of the skipper of the vessel. There's Denny, who Lana's initially, you know, she's drawn to. There's Joseph, who's a French guy who's there's sort of a mystery about his background, and they found him sort of living homeless and sort of really starving, and they took him on board and looked after him. And then we also have Shell and Henrik. So there's sort of quite a wide group of these young people living sort of this hedonistic lifestyle, hand to mouth, catching their food, you know, travelling, living free, swimming and partying and drinking on this boat, and till things aren't as much fun as they thought they would. And again, it's one of these stories where everybody has, or a lot of them have their own little secrets and backstories, and we don't fully know what's happened until sort of the reveal at the end. I really enjoyed this. I really like Lucy Clarke anyway. I do recommend her writing. If you like thrillers, she writes a really good page turner, so she's worth checking out. And there's quite a lot of books as well. She's got quite a good backlist that you can explore if you enjoy thrillers. So those are my books for August. As I say, I'll also include the link to my first August reads summary, because I've read 12 books in total for August, which is pretty good going, I think. And I look forward to knowing whether you've read them before or whether you're interested by any of them. But I shall see you in the comments. Thanks a lot, and I shall see you again next week. Take care. Bye.